Hi, everybody. Welcome to our panel. We'll be talking about the cheating war. We'll talk a little bit about what that means in a minute. But first, let me just welcome our panelists. We're very privileged to be on stage with Andrew Grauer, CEO of Course Hero, my colleague at Argos Education, head of learning science there, Dr. Anita Delahay, and the director of Every Learner Everywhere, Jessica Rowland Williams. Thank you all for joining us. So, it's very easy to use war analogies when we talk about cheating. It always was the sense of a war between the students and the teachers, or at least that's the way it gets painted. And these days with ed tech, that's gotten amplified. We hear about wars between so-called cheating sites or homework sites and the online proctors, and well, we'd like to kind of stop that. That doesn't seem very productive to us. So we're going to have a conversation today about a different way to think about this. So let me start with you, Andrew. You and I have been talking about this topic. You've been leading some conversations about this topic for a while. And I'll be honest, I took a little convincing to be sure that Course Hero was sincere about this, and I'm here today because I believe that you are. And so I think the question that the audience might want to know is that as a site that, among other things, is a homework help site that has a reputation for potential for abuse, why is it so important to you to engage in this conversation, and why are you personally engaging in this sort of listening tour that you've begun?
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. I'm Andrew, CEO and co-founder at Course Hero. And the reality is we have to start with our mission statement. And our goal at Course Hero is to help as many students as possible learn. Ultimately, we want to help students graduate confident and prepared. So if that's our objective, and that's the intent of everything that we're to build, that's why I've built Course Hero. I've dedicated 15 years of my life. That's why our colleagues joined Course Hero. It's our purpose. And so ultimately, we have to live up to that. We have to strive to make that a reality and authentic. And if we're to do that, we have to look at how we make Course Hero open, accessible, and flexible to use for as many students as possible. That's what we designed for. But we also have to then be realistic about when you do that, how can it be abused? How can the same thing be used for learning more affordably, more accessibly? How could it also be abused? And one way that we do that, and we've been engaging in a lot of conversations or setting up different events, is to engage and listen with educators. Like, you could think of it almost as a litmus test. Like, what do we think? But ultimately, what do educators or instructors in different colleges in the US think? And so we started this really almost 5 years ago, and we've built a community now of 70,000 instructors at Course Hero in our community. And a lot of what we do in terms of building our platform so that we don't just have students and resources contributed by students on the platform, we also have many resources contributed by over 70,000 instructors on the platform. And we did that by having conversations with them, figuring out what are their challenges in the classroom, what do they need help with for teaching, and how can you authentically build for assessments on the platform. And if they have issues, how do we understand them? How do we build to solve for them? How do we actually listen and learn and solve for problems? Like, ultimately, there's going to be problems, but we have to engage them. And we have to engage them to actually understand them, listen, try to understand, and then do the best we can to improve. And that's the culture that we have at Course Hero. So it can be uncomfortable. It is. And that's the reality. And we have to own up to that in order to actually authentically figure out how do we build the best site to help the most students learn better and more affordably.
Thank you, Andrew. I find very often when we have these conversations, especially the fraught ones, everybody wants to blame somebody, right? Teachers want to blame students, students want to blame teachers, academics want to blame the vendors, vendors want to blame the academics, right? So, and very often there's plenty of blame to go around, and there's a deeper underlying problem that nobody's really looking at that's systemic. So, Jessica, I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about why you think that this conversation about cheating is an equity issue.
Yeah, such a great question. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I think that, we have to really go back and remember that our universities were established to train the elite, right? Like, that's the history of our institutions. And in order to do that, there was a weeding out process that's really been built into the culture of higher ed. And assessments have always been kind of one of the pillars that we've used to weed out students, And, I think that because of that, we've built this culture where students are coming to institutions of higher education wanting to learn new skills, but needing to pass, right? So they want to learn, but they need to pass. And passing has become, the metric of success, right? And that is particularly problematic when we look at, the implications that has had and the ways that that's played out, particularly for our racially minoritized students, poverty-affected students, And so I think as we're looking towards the future and really, reframing this issue, I think one of the very first things we have to do is really rethink what student success means, right? What it means to be successful in a course. And how do we, build a culture at our institutions that really do emphasize learning and not just passing?
Yeah. So thank you for that, Jessica. There's a couple of words that came up. Well, one word that you just brought up is culture, right? And also that tension between learning and passing, the metric and the goal, right? And that reminded me of a conversation that you and I had earlier, Andrew, about the same challenge inside the workplace, which is also in the title of this this presentation. So, Andrew, when you think about metrics within your own company and driving performance within your own company, there's a similar tension, isn't there, between a KPI and a what you actually want to have happen. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you think about that and deal with that, not as an ed tech entrepreneur, but as a CEO of a growing company.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting analogy to try to exercise. You could, probably the only thing wrong in the first place to do is to not have some sort of management by objective system. But let's just say for some team working together, you could have a long-term objective, set your own mission and vision of what success looks like, and then generally set up, as you said, some form of KPIs to get a sense of progress, whether I'm making progress or not towards that long-term objective. And then finally, where the rubber hits the road is, what are we actually going to work on that's going to get us towards the goal and actually move these metrics? The reality is, you can always game metrics. And that's a challenge. If you just set one metric, usually, that's problematic. So then maybe you have to set a set of health metrics to judge the main metric. But the question, I think, ultimately, at the root of it, if I think about it, is do we have an authentic culture that is trying to build towards the intent of the metric that we're trying to move? If we have that shared buy-in, then it's great because you're actually trying to do what you want to do and what you mean by the metric. And you have to look at incentives. So incentive structures are incredibly important to understand, and then actually what are the real values and culture of that team. And that's more important than necessarily what that metric is, because you could nail that metric in the short term or say this year, but just like in education, if that was faulty or not sustainable, we fail the following year or whatever time period is defined. And it just gets more and more challenging if you use Saul Kahn's analogy, you get Swiss cheese education. You just get all these holes in your education, and you're just ultimately going to have a faulty foundation that just falls down over time. So I think it's actually incredibly useful analogy, since so much of education from our research is about students trying to get skills to be able to get a promotion, to get a job, to start a career. And at some point, there's learning how to learn, which is incredibly important, and also achieving and learning skills that I can use to go build or do something. So maybe I'll pause there. But in summary, the KPIs are always gameable. And so at the heart of it, do we have alignment of incentives together? And do we have a healthy culture that is getting at the heart of what we want to do with those metrics?
Yeah. And Jessica, now Andrew said some things that made me want to ask some questions of you. Let's talk a little bit about wanting to learn and needing to pass, right? And then tie that into what Andrew said about passing this year and failing the next year. Now, Andrew was talking about the company passing or failing the next year, right? But there are also employees or soon-to-be future employees who pass one year and fail the next year. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the framing of the way we approach cheating, and again, in that equity lens, how that sets students up for success or failure in the workplace.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, going back to, again, why they're coming to higher ed in the first place, right? Students are oftentimes coming to get degrees because they want jobs. They want the credential that they need to get the upward mobility. And I think that when we, in the culture that we have created, sometimes in our classrooms, where the focus, the emphasis is on the grade and just getting the grade, right? At any cost. Yeah. Just getting the grade and getting out the course. I know when we've all, heard, D for done, right? Like all of these things that we've heard and we've all experienced. I think, unfortunately, we've lost sight of the reason why we have these institutions in the first place, and what's really at the heart of why students go to school. It's not about, just getting the grade, but it really is about learning the skills. And it's really about, having opportunities to engage with new materials. Mm-hmm. And I think the way that plays out in the long run, to your point, is that when students are so focused on just getting the grade and just passing, and we don't have good ways to assess learning, then we're producing, students that are underprepared for the job market, and they don't always have the skills that they need, and they don't always have the perspectives that they could have gained, and they're at a disadvantage, when it comes to going into the workplace. And again, coming back to the point around how we know that this disproportionately affects minoritized students and poverty-affected students because they have even more pressure to pass, right? They don't always have opportunities to take the course again, and also a lot of times students are juggling competing priorities, working, having families, so when you've got all those external pressures and you're in a culture where all you have to do is make the grade, it's a recipe for disaster. And we're producing, students that don't have the skills because we were so focused on just getting the grade and not actually learning. And as we've said, it continues to have ripple effects, in the lives of our students.
So thank you for bringing up the context of these students' lives to the conversation. That's obviously critical and easy to lose sight of. Even so, I think probably there may be some folks who, when you say we lose sight of the true purpose of college, are going to want to say, well, maybe it's the students who are losing sight of the true purpose of college. So I'd like you to talk to me a little bit about the phrase academic integrity, which is not a term that students came up with.
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, so I think when I think about academic integrity, I think about it a little bit differently than most people do. Oftentimes when we hear that, we think about that as something that a student should own and how a student should be engaging, their academics. And I think about academic integrity in the sense of how the institution is showing up for the student, right? I think that when we are offering assessments to students that are not authentic assessments of how well what they've learned or what they know, then I actually believe that the institution is not holding up its end of the bargain. I think that's less about the student failing and more about the institution failing the student. And I think that, that's just a shift in thinking that we're going to have to eventually make, especially if we're going to get to a place where we begin to do better for our students.
Right. So I'd like to summarize a bit what we've talked about so far here, and I want to maybe reframe the notion of cheating away from academic integrity. What we've heard is that students, and by the way, workers, feel pressure. They want to learn, they want to get better at their schooling or at their jobs, but they need to pass. They need to succeed at work, they need to succeed in school, whatever it is. And there is a tension that we create. Some of it's inevitable, some of it's avoidable, right? So let's non-judgmentally redefine cheating as a behavior which leads to passing without learning, okay? Which can be detrimental to both the student or worker and to the company or the society or the university, right? We certainly, as a university, you don't want a reputation of having students that you've graduated who actually don't know anything and don't know how to learn. So, Anita, we know a fair bit. There's still a lot to learn, but we are learning about how to manage this tension. Can you talk to us a little bit about different ways that educators can approach managing this tension between passing and learning?
Yeah, and there's so many great points that have been made. I just want to say, I think the way that you're talking about this is really looking at the structural barriers that a lot of students face as they go to try to learn. And some of those might be time or resources. Some might be even understanding the expectations and how to address those expectations in their learning. And one that we haven't brought up yet, but I think is equally important, is how well the learning experience, the learner journey, is set up to help the student learn. So I'm going to give a little anecdote because I think it's illustrative. And this is one I experienced personally. Just a few years ago, I was talking with a professor, not a particularly mature professor, maybe in his 30s, very intelligent, great researcher in his field. And he told me that if his students' final grades do not conform to a normal distribution, he feels that his course has not been rigorous enough. And what he's really saying is, if essentially 2/3 of my students don't get between a B and a D, averaging on a C, my course has failed and my reputation as an instructor takes a hit. And I have to just say I was shocked that in today's day and age someone would think that way. It's such an outdated concept of rigor. It's really defining rigor in terms of difficulty rather than depth of opportunities for learning, which is how we really want to think about it. So, and in talking to my colleagues at academic integrity centers and listening to them, they absolutely echo what we've been talking about here, and that is, if a lot of instructors, the majority of instructors believe that when students cheat, they're bad people. And just that these norms are still in our culture today is shocking. So one of the ways that we can think about this is what are the types of learning environments, the classroom, learning activities, assessment types, engagement that can combat this. Because the reality is I don't think most students want to cheat. It's not the option of first resort. It's not an active choice. Rather, it's something that they come to because they run out of time, they run out of resources, they don't know what else to do. And ironically, you can think of it a little bit like an active strategy. It's just not one that we want to encourage. So, though, if I were to make one plug for, one type of learning activity that I think can go a long way toward combating the situation that students find themselves in, it's the inclusion of lots of opportunities early and often in the class for formative feedback, for low-stakes assignments, for group work, opportunities where students can get some early indication of how they're performing, what they know, what they don't know. The instructors similarly can start to, how is my instruction, how effective am I being, who's struggling, how do I reach out? And what the research also tells us is that when students engage in formative activities, they buy in to what's going on in the class. And as soon as you get students to start buying in, that changes the whole calculus. And so I think, I can name 4 or 5, I'll wrap up, but I can name 4 or 5 different, sort of learning science, really well-researched fundamental principles that formative practice and feedback, I don't want to leave feedback off, that's really an important part, provide. But it's so simple and it's so important, and I just don't think instructors always know how important it is.
I'm really struck by that phrase, buy in. Can you just unpack that a little bit more? What does what does it mean that when students have formative assessment practice problems, basically, that they buy in? Why does that happen?
I think it happens. If you engage on anything, you start to become, sort of aware. It's like you start down the road, you take one step, and then you say, I can take this. It's like the yellow brick road. I can take the second step. I can take the third step. It's not so daunting. And you see your colleagues going through the same process. By engaging in the activity, you're also engaging in the culture and engaging in the community and beginning to work with that and really understand. There are also key indicators for the students, what's important. It has to be aligned. The formative stuff has to be aligned to what's really being taught and what's really going to be assessed. But if it is, that's a wealth of information for students. What does the instructor care about? What should I be focusing on? I have something all of a sudden I can talk to that instructor about when I go to office hours, and I won't feel so overwhelmed and mute, So I think it just works on so many levels.
I think just one thing I want to add to that, one thing that we hear when we talk to students, our organization has a group of student fellows, and they say, we want to be able to learn from our failures. Yeah. And I think that's so important because that is how we learn. So how do we build in opportunities for students to fail in ways that produce learning, right? And how do we recognize that you don't only learn when you get it right? Yeah. Sometimes you learn when you get it wrong too.
That's right. And that's a workforce skill, by the way. So,
I was just going to ask you, Andrew. I think this sort of become cliched now. Fail fast, fail often, right? How do you think about failure inside your organization in terms of both at an organizational level and how you encourage your employees to think about it?
Well, I think you could engage that question in a lot of different ways. But maybe first and foremost, let's say we have a period of time where we just reviewed a quarter. And I think before let's say we review the metrics that we were discussing at the beginning, a set of KPIs. You could just immediately have a tone and an approach that seemed kind of pass or fail. And you would create a power dynamic that is not helpful. So really, actually, even the way that you approach that time or that assessment is incredibly important. It would be first seek to understand. And hey, what did happen? And why do you think that happened? And what did we learn from it? And oftentimes, I actually think in building things of value and learning, you really have to think of it as a positive-sum game. And learning is absolutely not, it shouldn't be that normal distribution. It should not be an internally hyper-competitive environment. It should be a positive sum game where I often would say in my head that it's a really dangerous path to focus on people's foibles or people's weaknesses. You actually really want to figure out what is that one or few things that somebody's really great at. We could fail 99 times, but if we get that one win, the upside on that is massive. And the downside on the negatives is, and you got to figure out whether these are company killer type losses or failures, but most of the times, no way, right? It's let's learn from those, but then let's focus on where the opportunity is and where the win is. And I think that is really important. It's not to say do away with that review or that assessment. It's about how does one engage it, and how do you actually discover what really matters, and then the next step is what do we do with it. And that's a really important moment to figure out whether you can make those right connections. And again, it's really important to do it in the first place, but how you do it is situational. And what is the real goal? Is it to look at failures and catch for failures? Or are you sifting for the nugget of opportunity? And I don't know, there's a human tendency to do the former. But actually, if you engage, you can find some really positive opportunities, and that's actually where all value creation tends to lie. And so, I don't know, again, I think there's a lot of connections there between the workplace, which is, especially in our knowledge economy, absolutely a learning environment, and how do we make the right connections into the learning and teaching environment.
Can I just add a point? So I wanted to just share, if you're not familiar with the World Economic Forum Top 10 Skills of the Future, I love this index. They go very broad, survey employers across the globe in all industries, and they produce a list every 5 years of what employers think the top 10 skills will be 5 years hence. And for the first time for 2025, they included a category called self-management. And 2 items in the top 10 fell under this category, self-management. And it's an interesting index as well, because a little bit it's a zeitgeist, what's on people's minds, what's on, 5 years ago, emotional intelligence was there, 10 years ago, active listening. So it really reflects what employers are thinking about. And the number 2 spot was active learning and learning strategies. And we often, as educators and researchers, we think a lot about providing active learning opportunities, but we mean the way in which we're facilitating students engaging with the content. And this is a little different. This is saying students themselves need to learn how to engage in active pursuit. And so as a workforce skill, all of the issues and all of the behaviors that we're talking about that come up in the context and may lead to cheating are going to persist throughout the career, and we need to sort of put the right behaviors in place early so that people can build their careers in many different directions.
So can you talk to us a little bit more about what the learning science tells us would facilitate that? What kinds of teaching practices?
Yeah, so, it can be from the very simple to the very complex, but some of the most studied and agreed upon, I'd say, principles of learning science, and you've probably heard of a lot of them: retrieval practice, spacing effect, doer effect, really all center on this notion of students are actively engaging with their learning. You can be an active reader, that's active learning as well, I want to be clear, and there are strategies for active reading, but the bottom line is not being a passive receiver of the instruction, but finding ways to really connect with it, to metacognitively ask yourself, am I understanding this? What can I do to further connect this to things that are important in my world, to other learning that I have? How do I recognize the gaps that I have? Those all are strategies for active learning. And so from that perspective, back to formative, practice, which is often, I think, the type of, sort of where students might first identify that they have a knowledge gap and might panic and reach out for all sorts of strategies, that's the perfect place for educators to sort of think very carefully about how to guide students at those critical moments and how to provide them the supports that they need to move forward productively.
Jessica, you're in a leadership position now. You're also an educator. You've been through enough schooling to get your Ph.D., which is a lot of schooling, let it be noted. As you think about this on a more personal level, as a student or an educator, I wonder, what is resonating with you about either practices that you wish that you had experienced or practices that you've experienced and found some joy as a student or an educator and then some success in?
Yeah, I think for me it really goes back to where you started, which is, we often think about cheating and we think about relationships between students and faculty as if there's this is a battle, it's a war, and we're on opposite sides of the field, and that couldn't be further from the truth, right? And we know that because there are so many instructors and faculty that care so deeply about their students and their students' learning. And the same is true for students. Students care so deeply about their futures and want to learn and are invested and engaged. And I think that it's just important to center that as a starting point. We're on the same team here. And this is not a war. If anything, it's a war against bad teaching and learning, right? And we really just want to be able to create learning environments that support students and support recognizing that all students are not the same, right? Our students are not a monolith. And, for myself, I went through a lot of schooling, but I was also a single mom for a lot of those years of schooling, right? And so I remember personally being up till, late at night studying because I had to take care of a child, right? Or my child was up with me at night. And so it was difficult for me to study. And so I didn't get any sleep. And, I think that students are so much more, there's so many parts of students' lives than what you see in a classroom or what you may see on a Zoom screen, and I think any opportunity that a faculty could take to connect with that student and actually get an understanding of what that student's goals are and what's important to them and what their priorities are and how all of that plays into how they're learning or what they need to learn, I just think is really transformative.
So you're reminding me of a story. I'm going to break frame as a moderator a little bit and tell my own story a little bit. I have the microphone, so no one can stop me. I did some focus groups a while back with college students about what that engaged them about classes and what didn't. And one of the things that they said that was really important to them was that an educator cares about whether I learn or not, when there's actually really good research that shows that students really do respond to that. And I can say from my own experiences as a college student that when I thought a professor did not care about my learning, I took it personally in some relatively counterproductive and occasionally self-destructive ways. But the important point here is that when I asked them how they would know if a teacher cared about their learning, they'd say things like, well, she'll quiz me in class, in front of the whole class, and if I haven't done the reading, it'll be embarrassing. I said, wait, you like that? Yeah, well, I don't like it, but I like the fact that she cares enough to check to know if I've learned it. And then I asked, excuse me, if that's the case, then why do all the professors on Rate My Professor get high ratings if they're easy? And every one of those students in every one of those focus groups broke out into a guilty smile. And they said, look, we want to love our classes. We want to get invested. We want to do more work than we have to do because we love our work. But we can't afford to do that with every class. So it's really important for us to navigate where we are going to put in our effort to where we're going to, what's that one item out of 100, that one gem, as you were saying, Andrew, that where we're really going to get the value. And so coming back to you, Andrew, I wonder, again, thinking as an employer building a company, how do you facilitate that attitude among your employees? And what are the sort of universal elements that you think are there about humans and motivation to balance between managing their time but still having that passion to learn, that maybe we can bring back to our conversation about needing to pass but wanting to learn?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, what are the things that necessarily I have to do versus what are the things that would give huge upside? And what are the things I'm really passionate about? And one framework that we have, for example, is, let's say for this next quarter, what are the one, max 2 or 3 things that I would spend all of my time on? What matters most? And if we did those things, that there would be value creation. And hopefully there's an overlap between, like, I really care about it. I've determined I want to do that. I think it's going to be valuable. And then everything else, relatively speaking, is noise. And so taking the time to determine what you just said was, like, this really matters to me. And so there's the intrinsic motivation. It's also hopefully value aligned with the organization. And then when doing that, then I'm positively incented to create a lot of value. I think that's really, really powerful. In cases there are things where there's just necessary conditions, I have to do it. And I think that gets back to what's learning and what's passing.
Great. I see we're getting, excuse me, we're getting close to the end of our time. So I'm going to ask each of you to just briefly reflect on the one thing that, just one thing you think that we could be doing or reframing or thinking about differently to begin to move the conversation and the classroom practices in a more healthy direction. Let's start with you, Jessica.
Students aren't the enemy. Instructors aren't the enemy. Let's find the real enemy, which may be outdated teaching and learning practices or outdated assessment practices, and let's tackle those together.
Fantastic. Anita?
I would just, if I had a crystal ball, make sure that every learning experience had a nice balance of low stakes to the inevitable need for assessment so that students feel like they are being encouraged and there's place and room and method by which they can learn.
Room to learn, room to fail, and room to succeed. Andrew?
I think from this conversation, I'd say, I think empathy and recognizing and celebrating more educators like Jessica. Like what you just said, that empathy as a student and an educator, what we've found is just there's an amazing number of educators who actually really care about active learning. And sharing with other educators and then connecting with students, recognizing and celebrating, amplifying that, I think is really, really powerful as a way to move forward.
Thank you all for a delightful conversation, and I hope you all in the audience here and out there found it useful and enlightening. I certainly did.